there, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well, and welcome to all the new people here. Uh, I was reading something about cognitive load the other day, and I decided that since this is more or less the beginning of the school year for most people, even if you're into it a month, especially if you've been into it for a month, I thought I'd talk about and explain cognitive load because this somewhat explains why it's difficult to learn and somewhat why it's easy and how one learns and how difficult it is at the beginning for everybody. And that goes for everybody else. So you've probably heard of things like the working memory and your long-term memory. I'm not going to go into real technicalities on that, but essentially what we're talking about here is that your working memory is the memory that you use when you start to learn something new, because you're going to have this input of data. And so you're going to have to think about this. If you're doing something that you normally do for, that you've done forever and ever and ever, you've got a skill that you've done for years that you don't even remember learning to some degree, that's no longer in working memory. It's in the long-term memory because you know what you're doing and you pick it up and do it automatically. The working memory is the thing that you use when you're having to put all those pieces together. This is essentially a fixed space, so to speak. So I could give you a couple of examples on that. So we could have something like learning a new language, or learning to play an instrument, or learning anything new, or going to a new city and trying to figure out where you are and have no idea where you are. So let me use that for the moment. When you're trying to go someplace, if you think in terms that you've got your point, whatever it is over here, and everything just focuses on that one point to some degree, and you've got all this input coming in and coming out, coming into that point, and that's where, in a sense, the overwhelm comes from, because you've got all those things. If you're learning a new language, you've got all those words that are coming into you. If you're learning your way around the new community, you've got all the streets, all the buildings, all the names, and everything else is overwhelming to you. If you're learning a new instrument, it's sort of like you're having to hold it. You're having to learn to maybe perhaps read music, how to make the sounds. If you're learning algebra, heaven forbid, you've got to learn all the symbols and what the new words mean and the new vocabulary. And your working memory literally just can't hold all of that. So what you're having to do, go back to this little thing again, which I didn't do really well, but hopefully you pulled it up, is you've got your start is at your basic point. And then you build a little circle around that. And then it gets wider and wider and wider around that. And so what you're trying to do with the working memory, or the cognitive load, if you will, is you're trying to get that core of information so that it becomes more known to you. It's not so unfamiliar. And then you can branch out. Let me use the street concept, the analogy. You move to a new city and you go from work to home and home to work, and you learn maybe one street. That's how you know how to do that. Or maybe you learn how to get to the grocery store and back home, and that's about all you can do. After you get those down and you begin to recognize what your signs are, or whatever it is that you use to manipulate, then you start to go out and look at the side streets. You branch out and try and do something different. So you're going out beyond that midpoint and making your circle wider so that you're getting newer feedback. And so some of the beginning issues that you had, like that first street from home to work, then becomes a part of your long-term memory and is no longer part of your working memory. So that means you can pull more information in and start working on improving that particular knowledge or that particular skill set. So if you're learning a new language and you're learning a bunch of words, once you start getting a couple of phrases that you recognize that you've got down pat, and those may be the only phrases you can say, but you know those, then that again changes that from working memory into your long-term memory. Think of any skill you had, learning an instrument or any skill, whether even if it's something similar like doing dishes. At one point in time, doing dishes was a difficult thing for you to do, because if you've ever watched little kids, they've got to figure out how to do all those parts. You don't just rinse them off and put them in the drain without washing them first, kind of thing. Even though it seems so obvious to you now, when you first learned to do those chores, you were overwhelmed with too many details about what comes first. Okay. And so essentially what the cognitive load is just the reason you get overwhelmed So if you recognize that this is going to happen to everybody, they may not show it quite the way you do, but the idea is that it comes to everybody. It's going to happen to everybody. I'm not sure whether or not well, I guess it does vary from person to person, but the issue here is going to be how much of whatever the new item that you're learning is that you know something about in the first place. So let's just say learning a new language. If you've never learned anything other than English and you're suddenly having to learn a new language, that's going to be very different than somebody you're not like a next door neighbor or maybe even a significant other who's learned another language prior to, and they've already had some language learning skills. So they have an idea of how to use a second language, because not only do they have their first language, in this case, we'll say English, but they've got, in a sense, the words from the second language that they can use, in a sense, pull everything together using 3 languages instead of just 1. So they're not going to have the same cognitive load that you would have with only just 1 language. Okay? Does this make sense? If you've never learned, if you're learning an instrument for the first time, 2 people are learning an instrument, but one already knows how to read music, the cognitive load for that person is going to be diminished, or increased. Wait a minute. Cognitive load for the person who can read music is going to be bigger, in a sense, than the person who doesn't know how to read music and has to learn everything from scratch. So that when you're saying, well, why am I having more trouble than my next door neighbor or whatever, it's because you don't know what are those pieces of information that person already has that makes that load, in a sense, shift. And some of the things that you're having trouble with because you see overwhelming because they're those very basic things that person already knows. Okay? So that over the course of time, all you're doing is really with practice, and that's where practice comes in, repetition. You get to know more about what you know, and then you can pick in other things about what you don't know, and then you can expand that so that your circle, if you will, gets wider and wider and wider until after a while, you forget that you didn't understand it in the first place. Because I dare say that most of you, well, probably all of you, don't remember learning English in the first place. And you probably, unless your family tells you little things that you said about, or maybe you've got nicknames that people, for example, that people have got because you couldn't say the full name when you were a baby. But they're not telling you all the stories about all the words you messed up because you just couldn't put all your sentences together because English was just so overwhelming. Same thing goes with any skill. Or you could even say, like, learning to ride a bike or learning to be on skates or anything else like that. So I hope this helped explain why you get overwhelmed. It happens to everybody. It's just learning to, in a sense, keep things limited for your working memory so that if you once recognize that you're getting overwhelmed, it's just step back and try and pull things back to the basics of what you absolutely need to do, and then add things on slowly but surely so that you're shifting things from your working memory into the long-term memory so you can pull more new material into the working memory. I hope that made sense. If it doesn't, send me a message and I'll see if I can clarify it for you, or maybe I'll redo this, depending on how confused I made all of you. But I hope it made sense to you about why, you get overwhelmed and why 2 people learning the same thing may not be or may not experience or demonstrate the same amount of overwhelmedness. Okay? Share this with somebody if you think that they can use it, and let me know whether you found it helpful or not. And just stay in touch and let me know what's going on. We'll see you again next week. Bye.